The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Penny Hayes, and I am the CEO of the Trust Bridge. I'm here today with my colleague David Clark and our partners at ESET, Alex Stoyanova.
Good morning.
Hi. This morning we're going to talk about the Cyber Resilience Bill that is soon to become an act and how that affects managed service providers because they're coming into scope. So we're calling the webinar irritant or critical, and we can determine that as we go through today. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is David Clark. Kind of previous roles, I've been responsible for operational and architectural cybersecurity for, at the time, the world's largest private trading network in the world, trading $3.5 trillion a day. I've been responsible for some global security operation centers operating across 4 continents and FTSE 500 customers, and kind of recently a lot more on data protection and cybersecurity standards, and co-author of one of 4 regulator-approved GDPR certification schemes.
With the ICO was being one of them, yeah.
With the ICO, yeah.
And Alex.
Sure, thank you. I'm afraid my CV isn't as impressive as David's. My name is Alex. Nice to meet you, everyone. I've been with ESET for just under 10 years. I'm currently a strategic MSP account manager looking after ESET UK's top MSP partners. I've got a business and marketing degree, and previous to security, I've been involved with software development and the management of that itself. So I've seen transition from traditional antivirus to the situation we're in now, which is a multi-layered security. I think I would love to share some of my views and experiences today, which is why we very much value your input as well.
So you are very much aware of the fact that MSPs are now coming into scope under the new Act, as will be. And of course, we all know that regulation and compliance is becoming more complex. And of course, under increasing visibility due to the increase of threats to data, the requirement for protection and the management of risk from cyber threats. Managed service providers are being brought into the scope, as we've said, primarily because they hold privileged and often continuous access to data from multiple clients. And they're a significant part of the supply chain. And that's not just third level, but we're now talking about 4th and 5th level supply chain. And also they're often part of the national critical infrastructure. So, David, this makes them very high-value targets for attackers, presumably, and thus a significant supply chain vulnerability. Is that why they're being brought into scope?
I think that's exactly why they're being brought into scope, because an MSP, if you compromise an MSP, how many customers have they got? 50, 100 more. You potentially have the ability to then compromise a huge amount of customers. And MSPs are generally kind of used for their technical capabilities and their guidance in many of these kind of matters to help customers stay as secure as is possible. And we've noticed the NCSC this year, they've updated their cyber assessment framework. They've written letters to the business organizations in the UK saying, customers must up their game on this.
But clients have kind of assumed or even expected that their MSP will take responsibility for cyber on their behalf, which brings its own issues, obviously. And some of the MSPs we've worked with have always found that quite concerning because of the liability that brings for them. What's the difference now? And is that going to make MSPs more liable?
I think that's kind of where this legislation is pushing things, and it's always a kind of fine line between, is the MSP just doing tasks that are outsourced, or is it providing a security function? And quite often that isn't defined. So it may be that a company says to the MSP, set up my my antivirus, my XDR, my MDR, but actually how it's organized, how it's run, how it's operated, they should have oversight of and kind of understand that and have the final word. Otherwise, really what they've done is You know, you've got the builder in, he's put the bricks in place, he's put the doors in place, but no one's necessarily providing the oversight.
Right, okay, that makes sense. And presumably the first thing they've got to do, the MSPs have got to do is get their own house in order. So there's a few key things they need to do.
And that will be absolutely critical, because unfortunately this will almost certainly require an evidence trail that an MSP has done the right things. They've have a proper approval system. Things are tried, tested, pen tested, vulnerability tested, and that the customer is fully informed of all of this. So it's not a random event. It's not like, you know, a couple of lines in a contract that nobody looks at for 5-10 years. It will have to be, you know, regularly distributed to the customers.
So communication is absolutely critical, and transparency as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think one of the first things that we also advise people is to get registered with the ICO, which is something they may forget. It costs some money, not a lot, but you should be registered with the ICO.
And they probably need to be doing it anyway.
I think one of the biggest changes perhaps is all around incident reporting, because there's now a 2-stage process for that. Can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the CRA now, it's going to be a 24-hour notification rather than, I think, what we're used to on the GDPR, the 72-hour. And it's also, how are you going to inform your customers if it's needed? How will that happen? How do you do it securely? And kind of conversely, how do you escalate incidents both ways? So the MSP knows you're having a trouble, or the MSP can inform the customer that there is kind of trouble. And, you know, the quicker this happens, the better the outcome usually. It's never a good outcome, but at least you can try and aim for a better outcome.
Definitely. And of course, there are consequences, some of those being some of the penalties, which we've seen before under GDPR. Is it similar under the CRA?
Yeah, the penalties are quite kind of severe. Percentage of, you know, usual annual turnover, I think it's up to 17 million. But I think the bigger price is loss of customers and reputation. You know, it's hard to get a customer, it's hard to maintain a customer, and to lose that is absolutely, you know, would be an absolute nightmare.
Do you see being compliant then as critical for gaining clients?
I think one of the things the regulation does talk about is that it kind of wants what's happening with DORA and NIS2 in Europe, and both those pieces of legislation in Europe are very, very kind of strong on supplier due diligence. So, you know, they're quite keen that you do third-party due diligence. There's a lot of inference that fourth-party due diligence, and what we've seen with customers, there's even kind of fifth-party due diligence. You know, your customer, or your supplier is valid.
Well, we've always said
and he's
that
doing the right thing.
Some of the vulnerability is quite often in the supply chain, and it might be fourth and fifth and even sixth level.
Yeah.
You mentioned NIS2. Are there massive differences between NIS2 and the Cyber Resilience Bill Act?
Well, I think the way they're referring to NIS2 and DORA is that is now best practice in terms of especially the supply chain. I mean, DORA has actually some quite tight specification on how they want penetration tests done. DORA's even worse because it's a 4-hour notification period. NIS2 is more focused on critical national infrastructure kind of companies. So actually what it is very much looking like, MSPs are going to be treated as critical national infrastructure by the requirements put upon them.
So that's going to bring some consequences in itself. So we've talked about, you know, some of the key requirements. What do you think are the really critical requirements for MSPs now, immediately?
I think the main thing is to be able to kind of evidence that they are aligning with cyber best practice, which is pretty much well documented by the NCSC and CISA in the US, which are kind of great as a baseline. They can evidence that they're regularly monitoring that, and it's regularly updated, because it's kind of easy to say, and we've seen this many times. You'll ask a company, do you guys use MFA? And they'll go, yeah, we use MFA. And then you find out, except for senior partners or the MD or whatever. And then you kind of find actually there are many levels of MFA. you know, the basic level now is bypassed really easily. CISA has kind of defined 3 levels of MFA where you need extra criteria like, you know, location, country location, etc., to make it stronger. So if I go to a place far away in the world, my MFA won't work because it's not allowed to be used in those areas. So the tighter it is, the better it is.
We've found in our experience that quite a few of MSPs are now asking to be ISO certified. Alex, is it in your experience, are many of the MSPs that ESET works with, are they already on this journey or have they got ISO certified?
Yeah, certainly. Over the last few years, it has been a trend. I wouldn't say it was a big wave of certifications, but you can see the regulation slowly creeping up through the whole channel, 27001 and 9001 as well.
And they need that really, don't they, in order to be able to then advise their own customers who may need to be certified. And
well, and kind of what we're kind of seeing as well, it's, you know, all the standards are good. Yeah, we're seeing ISO 9001, as Alex said, 27001, a lot of interest in 42001, which is about AI, and many of the MSPs that we work with are doing quite a few things with AI, which is not a bad thing. I think you need to be using AI in this sort of competitive marketplace, but it's kind of how you manage it. And I think the other kind of thing we're seeing in the UK, especially if you deal with government, is ISO 20000, which is going to basically how you kind of manage issues and problems in very brief summary.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But there's going to be crossover in a lot of these things, aren't there? The different standards and the different regulations.
Oh, huge amount of crossover, and there is overlap in many of them. Absolutely, and they do sort of help each other, and you know, you can, you know, what's called kind of integrate 9001 and 27001, and in many cases that makes a lot of sense. The 42001 big overlap with 27001, the cyber standard to the AI standard, and I think, you know, we are kind of now seeing lots of discussion and possible kind of data leakage now due to AI, and the AI Act itself says actually GDPR trumps the AI Act. So if you have a data leakage, you're potentially in GDPR zone. If you're in the GDPR zone, you're probably going to get hit on the NIS2, DORA, and CRA zone. So they could well be levering each other. Yeah.
So many of these, because we've also got
Chain
the
effect.
National Cybersecurity
Absolutely.
new framework known as CAF, which stands for what?
Cyber Assessment Framework.
Right.
And it's a nice framework. It's quite high level to do, but I think the reality is once you start deep diving in it, there's a lot of detail to be organized and managed.
It's interesting what you say there about GDPR being the sort of bedrock, if you like, of most of this stuff, and it trumping other things. So we're still referring back to GDPR, despite the fact that it's now 7 years old.
Oh, absolutely, and there is a kind of a movement, inverted commas, by the authorities in Europe to try and align some of these acts, because unfortunately they're all different regulators, which doesn't help as well. So, you know, it makes it much more complicated. And I think what we're seeing is the poor people who have to manage GDPR are kind of now having to manage NIS2 and DORA, and potentially CRA, because if you've got an MSP, you want to make sure that they're up to speed and know exactly what they're responsible for.
DORA is an interesting one because, you know, on the surface it looks as if it's really only applicable to financial institutions, but in fact it's not. It's applicable to anyone who provides services to the financial services industry.
Yeah, exactly. So you could be supplying a DORA, somebody who's in scope of DORA, especially from ICT, and now by the knock-on effect, you're in scope as well. Absolutely.
An example of that, from our own experience, we have a client who is a research company that does quite a bit of research for some of the high street banks. So they they obviously have to be compliant under DORA for that reason. Yeah.
They have to evidence that they're doing all the right things to their client to help them become compliant with DORA. Absolutely.
Now, there's some slight confusion, I think, under the CRA, sort of the bill as it still is, whether or not small, medium-sized and large MSPs are affected by this, but pretty much from our experience, it's everyone.
It is everyone, and I think they've made it a little bit confusing, unfortunately, the way that it is. What they wanted to do was categorize the MSPs into different types of category, but they're all in, shall we say, the firing line. Obviously, some MSPs will be providing their own cloud services, for example, and they will be in a separate category. There's been talk that there are exemptions for very small MSPs, and then the trouble is, on those exemptions, there are exemptions that put you back in scope. So it's not quite as straightforward as it sounds.
So the poor old MSP is really going to need some experience help in this, because it is so complicated, as most compliance.
It is complicated, and it sort of sounds simple when you first start talking about it, and the more you dive in, you go, yes, unless you're standing on one leg and the moon's high, you're in scope, but then for the other bit, you are. Yeah. You're not in scope. So
there are some challenges, clearly, and not least is unraveling all of this. We've talked about the regulatory overlap. But it's going to be a resource-hungry element of the service, isn't it?
It is, but I think the one thing about MSPs, they generally do a pretty good job, and I think that's easy to forget. What then needs to happen is some of that just needs to be formalised. Lever off the good work they're doing already, formalise it, document it, evidence it, make sure that it can be approved, reviewed, etc. And then once it's in place, it shouldn't be such an operational burden.
And we've talked about the liability exposure. I mean, some of the MSPs we've worked with have said they have disclaimers in their supply contracts, their client contracts. Are they going to be able to do that now?
I think that's kind of an interesting thing. Can you put in a contract, actually, we don't have this problem because it's in the contract, or we don't have this problem because we're doing the right thing and we can evidence it. And I suspect the regulators may not be too concerned about what's in the contract as the main thing, but more like, can you evidence what you're doing is appropriate?
That's exactly what I keep hearing from a lot of my partners, actually, about the contracts with their customers, but that surely doesn't go over legislation as such, from what you just said, David.
I think it's hard. It's a bit like when I work for Penny. I can then sign away my rights that Penny can give me a good beating every Thursday. That will still be illegal, even though it's in my contract. I'm being a bit extreme here, but yeah.
I think it's a good example. As ICO will be coming with heavy powers towards punishment in a way. So.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully they'll do their normal kind of soft touch, but I think there is a lot of concern about the cyber warfare that's going on at the moment. It's got really, really warm, really, really hot, and British business needs to kind of be as robust as it possibly can.
So the client now can't say, well, look, the MSP is now in scope of this new act, so therefore I delegate all responsibility to the MSP for my cybersecurity because they're looking after my data. It's not as simple as that.
No, you can't do that, but that's why the clarity is needed, to kind of make sure the MSP goes, this is exactly what we're doing, this is what we would like you to do as a customer. If you don't do this, or you're not doing it maybe as you should, this has to be documented, and we both need to agree that this is exactly, you're not changing the passwords or managing your users, joiner movers, leavers. That's not something that we can do. That's your responsibility, but we will kind of make sure the technical systems are in place, and that just needs to make sure that's very clear and clarified.
So that's a sort of a risk assessment with the client, and then if the client's got an appetite for higher risk, they have to document that. Okay,
yeah,
because that's definitely been a concern we've seen, and I'm sure you have, Alex, too, that how does this affect me, the MSP? And my client's going to rely on me more, and am I going to be exposed with greater liability, which is obviously a key challenge for them all, definitely. There'll be costs attached, presumably, to all of this, David, with security upgrades, as we talked about policy documentation. You talk about evidence a lot, auditing, and then the incident response side of things. I mean, we've been brought in to do some incident response. There is clearly a cost involved, not least because quite often the whole operation is put on hold. So these additional costs are going to be quite significant, would you say?
They have the potential to be significant, yeah. But I think it's like most of these things, you know, when companies first start doing ISO and 9001, there's a big kind of mountain to climb. But once that mountain's climbed, it's much easier to maintain it than it is to build it.
Yeah, of course. And audits, what sort of audits are we looking at? Are we looking at casual audits that they can effectively self-audit or bring in an external auditor, or do they need to go through the proper standards?
It's probably kind of initially, yeah, you could probably do internal audit, but remember, internal audit should be seen to be quite robust. When you do an internal audit for, say, an ISO standard, if the auditor thinks that your internal audit is way too light touch and soft touch, he will just stop the audit there and then and go, major non-conformity, you guys don't understand what's going on, try again. So internal audit is a double-edged sword, really.
Right, okay, but at the same time, having said that, from one audit to the next, you need to be demonstrating improvement.
Absolutely, and continuous improvement is the key for most of this.
Staff training. Now, staff training is becoming mandatory. Is that part of the CRB?
Training is always part of every regulation, and what we've kind of found from the other side of the coin is when we're helping customers doing their due diligence, as a supplier, they're now, I haven't seen this, you know, till recently, the content of their training is being asked about, rather than just saying, oh, he's done cyber training, a bit of data protection, and everyone leaves it at that. They're actually saying the content of some of these trainings need to be in the training, and you have to evidence that. So, you know, we're already seeing that from due diligence questionnaires. So I kind of suspect, and this is something that we've always kind of done, is broken down the training so it's appropriate for the role, rather than, you know, everyone's got to know you need 14 characters. Well, actually, you probably don't, because it's the system set up to do 14 characters, and you don't need, you just follow instruction, you know, whereas the people implementing it will need to know, yes, you must set the system up to be 14 characters or whatever.
Now, one of the things that we always recommend is that senior management is also trained, and the liability for a lot of this is at board level, so they need to be aware as well. Quite often we've seen some of the breaches happen, the security incidents happen at the high level, so we would recommend that staff training includes everybody, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things is, I think the senior management often may need kind of slightly more focused training as well. It's not because they don't know it or they don't understand it, but if you've never come across it before, it kind of really helps them to know, what do you focus on, what do you need to do, what decisions you may need to make. And it's not going to necessarily be nice decisions, it's just less worse than making no decision.
So couple of, on this slide here, we've got a couple of things that are quite key in terms of the CRA. Or when do we see this being implemented? The CRA, it's still a bill at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, they haven't given a date, but it's expected in 2026.
They said it was expected in 2025, but it's still
but at least they've seemed to have written most of it. I'm not sure that it's totally finished, and I kind of suspect, as usual, that once it becomes legislation, the guidance will come out, which seems to be the way that actually you do the legislation and then tell people how to do it. So I think it will probably follow that trend.
And we've talked about how MSPs are now into the same regulatory zone as the critical national infrastructure operators because they're part of the supply chain. You know, and our message, unfortunately, is that compliance is no longer an option. But we do see it as an opportunity for MSPs to offer this advice and help to their clients in order to get greater engagement with the client, greater trust and credibility with the client. One thing we haven't talked about, and there's a question here on this, is AI. We haven't talked about it particularly. So in the face of these changes, how do you feel that people should use AI, and where does it fit under the CRA?
I think it's going to be really, really important. I think there's still a lot of learning that everyone has to do about AI. I think it's almost impossible to do any job or role without, you look at all the big platforms, AI is built in straight away. You can't avoid AI. And it's really how that's going to be governed and how that's going to be managed. And although I think that sounds kind of simple, I think there's a lot of complication that needs to be taken into account on the AI.
Alex was talking earlier about how some AI models export data for processing to third countries. Is this likely to be affected?
Particularly around the freemium models.
Yeah, exactly. How will that be dealt with?
Yeah, I think there's an amazingly confusion. I mean, I won't kind of mention names, but one of the kind of big names, if you have the personal accounts, even the paid for accounts, in the US, they are not allowed to delete the data. Even if you think you've deleted the data, they as a company are not allowed to delete that data. But if you have the enterprise model of the same thing, you can delete the data, and apparently it is deleted, at base, shall we say. And there's these levels of confusion about actually what is going on with the data, and also use of the data. Does this data somehow get reused, intellectual property, information about individuals? And I think that's still a worry.
Yeah, I can imagine. We've talked about how potentially MSPs can use this as a way to build their business. Do you think that if MSPs don't get with the program and don't get their own house in order, there's a risk to them for survival? I mean, that's a bit dramatic.
Well, if the customer has to demonstrate to their customers, and the only way most customers make the big bucks is by selling to big companies, it's going to be, are you doing this? Are your supply chain doing this? And can you prove it? So I think the knock-on effect of due diligence is going to be the one of the big effects.
So the supplier questionnaires that we've been seeing coming through, which are pretty intense and use up quite a lot of resource, you think they're only going to increase?
I think they're getting worse. As I said, what we've now seen in the last few months, not only do they want to know that staff have done training, they want to know what's in that training, just to kind of make sure. And they also now kind of want to see, what are you doing about AI? How are you managing it? They still seem to be quite light touch, but there are questions about AI, which is, we haven't really seen before.
And so really getting everything in order, getting yourselves standard certified, having a ready-made answer to questionnaires, if you like, demonstrating that you are within.
Yeah, it's doing the best you can. Nobody's ever going to be perfect, but it's actually kind of show, we understand the problem. We're doing the best we can with the resources we have.
Well, talking about resources, that was another question that came up, that obviously these structures are being introduced, and there are implications, as we've talked about, for MSPs. What access to resource is there for the MSP?
I think that's kind of an interesting one, because I think some of the resources got to come from internal. Some you may be able to get external resource to kind of give you guidance. And I think one of the kind of things that may be useful, and I've noticed that when I've effectively been part of an MSP, is we used to see problems once a week that even the biggest companies in the world might see once a year, which means if you're only seeing a problem once a year, you're going to be okay, but it's going to be slower to fix, slower to understand. Whereas if you're talking to an organization that sees these problems kind of weekly, your time to resolution will be a lot quicker, and you'll understand what works best and what doesn't work best.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. So Alex, we've talked about security being a business opportunity, and clearly with ESET, managed DNR is a great way to start. So do you want to tell us a little bit about how you see that helping in this environment?
Yeah, sure. I think based on what's been discussed so far, and on our experience dealing with managed service providers, certainly in the course of the last 10 years, I can say we've seen 3 different types of MSPs naturally transitioning and growing as we go along. So if we take a step back few years ago, used to have a traditional, what I call MSP version 1.0 partner, who was providing the hardware and the software. Here you go, Mr. Customer, take that piece of software and hardware and you can perform your day-to-day tasks. It's all talking to the internet, everyone's happy. So it's like a handover process, basically. We then moved on to MSPs effectively becoming the IT department on behalf of those end users, becoming their virtual CTOs, you know, and making those decisions on how to design that infrastructure, what softwares are chosen, negotiate price with suppliers, etc. But I think with the upcoming legislations, we've got we've really got a big change upcoming, because what I think an MSP 3.0 looks like is partnerships with experts like ourselves, like yourselves, and third-party companies, and it's based on those relationships and expertise that effectively defines their value proposition. So to really answer your question, Penny, I think the package or the packages of options that those MSPs provide really need to be thought about legislation, compliance, but also what relationships are put into those packages, you know, the intangible part of it, you know, the ability to pull extra resources, extra information, and effectively become a business consultancy. It's not just providing the IT and making the decisions, but creating security by design. I think that's what most legislation and compliance refers to these days. It's the processes that yourselves as an MSP, but also the end customers follow to be secure, not just the tools, the processes that you've got in place. And so partnerships there are really, really key element of that. And, you know, the perfect example David mentioned earlier, AI. I mean, obviously, end customers will be asking their MSPs about how to implement AI. And while it's a topic completely out of everyone's comfort zone at the moment, really, I think the logical step is for the MSPs to help those businesses. So it's got to be thought by design and implemented in the correct way, as opposed to MSP 1.0 example. Here you go, there's AI, just use it. It's up to you. What do you do with it? You know, that's no longer really a good answer. So
you're absolutely right.
I think
one of the things we saw at the MSP Global show in October was the industry polls being presented there, and partnerships, alliance partnerships, was absolutely the number one, with number two being compliance and compliance as a service. But yes, you're absolutely right that partnerships becoming much more than an IT support organisation, being a consultancy in this area was absolutely the main message. So you're right in that respect, and you know, hence partnerships like ours and various others that are happening in the marketplace. So you're right, absolutely, Alex.
Yeah, certainly. So in the area of AI, we actually start valuing the human relationships a lot more currently, because that's what builds the value proposition and can give MSPs unique competitive edge. Referring back to your previous comment, it's probably unlikely to push anyone completely out of the market, but it can give you that edge, that competitiveness against other managed service providers who are not as compliant, if we can define it this way, or not as proactive, perhaps, is a better way of putting it. And that's the edge right now. And I think, kind of referring to the current slide here, a lot of that is the quality of vendors you deal with, but you will notice the Cyber Resilience Act bill, when it comes into play, it's going to require, just like GDPR, reporting in a timely fashion. So information and expertise coming from those vendors needs to be ready, needs to be reportable on in a very timely fashion. You need to know your business inside out and be able to point out what went wrong in case there's a potential breach or even worse, ongoing engagement with a third party because of data leakage, etc. So one area we can help with, obviously, as security experts, is the managed detection response service, which of course is our bread and butter. And I think the critical elements of a service like that is, again, the accurate insight into the threat landscape that enables you to see more and respond quicker. The fact that it is 365, I mean, threat actors never sleep, arguably speaking, because we all work, probably it's a post-COVID syndrome, but because we all work remotely, it is a 24/7 thing. You log in the evening, do your emails, etc. And every business is really, in a way, a 24/7 business these days. And that's
on that point. We have a question here actually from one of our guests today. It says, as a small MSP, are we required to notify client incidents or just incidents that affect our own systems? Most of us use third parties. If it's a third party incident, is that our responsibility? And also regarding the timing, I mean, that might be a question for David. What's looking to what Alex was saying in terms of the managed response? What's the responsibility?
I think there's a couple of things on there. If it is clearly containable in the MSP and it's kind of localized, they probably have no need to inform their clients, a bit like GDPR. I think kind of the worries quite often will be, if a client is compromised, will that spread to other clients? And that would be my kind of big worry, that actually you've got something, it's not fully understood, because it never is in the sort of first few days probably, is that got a capability of spreading everywhere. So not only will it affect the number one client, it could affect the next 50. So it's kind of bearing all those in mind, and sometimes it is better to kind of inform customers, look, we have an issue, be prepared.
Right. Alex, that's something that you guys can help with.
Yeah, certainly. And again, the knowledge here as to what happened is really the key. If you know exactly where that threat has come from, how it was behaving, if you like, and have that information will help you communicate with your clients and say, look, there's been a small incident, be aware of it, but we've contained it because we are quite certain it's this and that, and we've taken these and these steps to counteract it, which is where, again, from a cybersecurity perspective, a managed detection response service is invaluable, because you've got your ability to report, it's 24/7, you apply expertise, you apply the MITRE ATT&CK framework in our case, and that is where vendors like ourselves share information globally on behavioral analytics, on behavioral tactics that criminals use, and the ability to access that information and apply it to anyone's environment is really key as to how you understand an incident and how you respond to it. And that's not something someone can sell, I suppose. It's expertise through a vendor built over a number of years. You know, it's, for example, David's expertise being part of an MSP, being part of critical infrastructure, and the knowledge on dealing with security by design, I guess. So that's what's really valuable here. What partnerships you've got, and again, well, thinking of AI, how do you combine AI with human expertise? Because a managed detection response service actually is a fine balance between the two. You will have seen most of AI these days is LLM, large language models. Those are particularly great in synthesizing vast amounts of data. So again, thinking of behavior analytics. It can point out behaviors that are potentially malicious because it can synthesize every activity of every machine around the network. But it's what do you do with that? It's where you apply the actual human intelligence on top of it and counteract those malicious activities, I guess, or criminal groups. Like David explained earlier, documenting that is the critical bit, provided the process is described and you've got a reliable vendor and relationships, then should anything go wrong, you've got, 2 feet to stand on, not just one, and really back this up with the data and the intelligence, and all of that with localized support. You think about that. And I don't mean just security, but the vendors you partner with, are they supported in the local language? Is that potentially a 24/7 if it's needed? And is that just a resale relationship, or there's more to it? Is there a value add? And because the value add is what gives that competitive edge over the dark side, as I like to call it.
Definitely. You're right. Absolutely right. Questions. Now we have one question here, which is relating to DORA. David, it's probably for you. Is DORA applicable to UK companies who only deal with UK clients? It's actually a European.
I would agree. In theory, it probably doesn't apply. But what tends to happen is that if you have a European company who's in the financial markets, it kind of will apply. And as we were saying earlier, the CRA is now designed to be aligned with best practice from DORA. So it may not be a direct application, but definitely inferred. And I'd kind of just like to kind of add one more thing to what Alex was talking about, the MDR, which we've found incredibly important, is if the incident is a fair size incident, you will run out of resource really quickly and you'll need to figure out where to get that extra resource. But the advantage of having MDR is it's very difficult without this type of technology to say, is the incident over? Is it finished? Is it under control? And we've estimated from the incidents that we've looked at, you kind of get a resource leverage of 5 to 8 times. So instead of it taking weeks to kind of go through every device, every server and go, yeah, we're kind of good to go, this can be done way, way quicker with way less resource. So the ability to be able to kind of sign off your own infrastructure and say, yeah, we've got a high probability this is now safe is absolutely amazing. Doing it manually, so painful. Using technology like MDR, it's just incredible. And that speed saves time, money, keeps customers.
And also helps with the meeting up with the requirements of reporting, presumably the time requirements.
Yeah. And it's proactive, which again will have a competitive edge. If I can be a bit salesy here, I guess, and at the point when I deal with partners, we obviously aim to expand on managed detection response services across the entire customer basis. Against a certain commitment, we're happy to also honor non-free sale keys. So, for example, as a vendor, what we mostly care about is that our partners use that technology to be able to replicate it across customers, which then ultimately helps towards compliance, but puts focus on protecting the MSP first, and then we roll it out across. And I think that's very important to consider regarding the approach we take.
Definitely. That was really helpful, guys. I think the CRA, well, as we said earlier, it's a bill. We think it will come in to be a regulation fairly soon. David, you know the score. I normally ask at the end of all of our webinars what would be your sort of top tip for our audience to make sure that they are prepared, ready to battle. So what's your top tip today?
I think it's probably going to be kind of my usual, because I think that there's the maximum benefit. Yeah, it's one thing managing an incident. the thing before that is having a really robust and fast escalation process. So if there's a problem, it doesn't get hidden. You can always downgrade the escalation when you've looked at it. The faster that's done, getting the right people involved, the better the outcome.
That's really important. And Alex, what would you say your top tip for MSPs?
I think, again, be proactive to get the competitive edge. Trust your partnerships and get their expertise into it, and be that MSP 3.0. The sooner you are, the better the outcome for yourself and your client base.
And I think really building on what you were saying earlier, bringing in partners who are experts in the field. David said, bring in external resource if you need. And I think bringing in expert partners who have done a lot of this stuff and understand this stuff is probably one of the key things to maintain any kind of competitive edge, definitely. Thank you both very much indeed. Unless we've got any more questions, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks,
Thank
Alex.
you very much.
Thanks.
It was a pleasure. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.